Well, welcome to the first dose of science for 2022. Quite unbelievable. 2022. My goodness, it seems like it was yesterday that we were worried about the year 2000 and the havoc it was going to wreak with our computers, which of course never happened. Now the worry is quite different. What is going to happen with COVID in the coming year? One would hope that it's going to be better than what we saw this year, but that's what we said at this point last year as well. So the only thing we can predict about COVID is that it is unpredictable. What is predictable is that we will be coming your way with a dose of science every month, giving you some tasty morsels of information about COVID and about other stuff. And as you know, the mandate of our office is to separate sense from nonsense. That's what we do. And joining me today is my colleague, Jonathan. And we're going to address several different things here today. But since, as I said, our mandate is to separate sense from nonsense, I want to start with a little bit of what I think is quite delicious nonsense. So let me just share my screen here. And what you're looking at there is a billboard that appeared in Memphis, Tennessee. It appeared in other places since then as well. Birds aren't real. Well, what are we looking at here? We're looking at the brainchild of a young guy by the name of Peter McIndoe, who says that birds aren't real. The birds that we're looking at, in fact, are mechanical devices because the government, the deep state, the CIA, has basically wiped out the bird population with some sort of toxin and replaced them with mechanical birds that are spying on us all the time. And he tells us that these are very ingeniously devised creatures. They have a camera and they can listen in on what we are saying as well. They are, of course, are battery operated. And the reason that we see birds sitting on lines, on power lines, is because that is how they are recharging their batteries. And Peter has launched a campaign. For example, he does not like Twitter. He wants Twitter to get rid of the bird logo because that logo suggests that birds are real, whereas he tells us that they actually aren't. He's organized demonstrations across the country to protest against the government doings about what they have done to the birds. And they want people to stand up for their rights because they are being spied upon. And all kinds of demonstrations in St. Louis. He burned a flag. What flag? The flag of the St. Louis Cardinals, the baseball team, because it implies that Cardinals are real. Well, he has also produced a number of videos and he has guested on talk shows. And I must say that he's done a very, very clever job. I mean, obviously, this is all a parody of the lunacy that is happening in the world, particularly in the United States, where people will believe absolutely anything. And we've seen a number of parodies, in the last little while about the anti-science movement in the United States, including a very, very good movie on Netflix, Don't Look Up, which stars Leonardo DiCaprio and Jennifer Lawrence. And they even have an appearance by Meryl Streep, who plays the US president, very much in the Trump vein. And the theme of that movie is that the Earth is on the verge of being destroyed by a comet, but nobody believes the astronomers who are saying this. And, it's kind of a kick at the climate change deniers. Clever movie. Well, in this case, with the birds aren't real, what they target all the nonsensical movements out there, whether it be the anti-vax movement or the 9/11 conspiracy, all of this. And it is done in I think, a clever way, especially in the video, which they make it look like it is an actual documentary. I think it is so overboard that I doubt that anyone would believe this. But again, looking at some of the stuff that we see in the US these days, maybe there are some people who believe it. But I'm sure that none of our viewers, so I'm quite confident in telling you that this is worth watching because you will be entertained. Nonsense, of course, knows no bounds, especially when it comes to COVID. And from the beginning of this infliction, we have had all kinds of suggestions of what to do. In India, it all started with drinking your own urine, and this nonsense now has crossed over to North America. And this critter, who's a very, very big one in the anti-vax movement, and as you can see, is not averse to violence. He calls himself the vaccine police, and of course suggests that the vaccine is poisoning us, and we should totally stay away from it. But of course, he's got to have an alternative, and the alternative is urine. If you just drink your urine, you'll be okay. Now, this movement is actually not new. It goes back to the 1940s when J.W. Armstrong, a naturopath in England, came up with this absurd idea that if you drink your urine, you'll be healthy. And one would think that this would have been immediately dismissed, but turns out not to be the case. This movement has snowballed. And there are numerous books that have been written about this, telling you exactly how to drink your own urine. I'm not sure why that would be a challenge, because it just amounts to peeing into a cup and drinking it. But if you are worried that it might not be a good thing to drink human urine, well, you can also drink the urine of cows. This wisdom also comes from India, where they actually sell bottled cow urine. And at the beginning of COVID, and still persist, there's the advice of drinking urine in order to ward off this disease. And as you can see here, the question is, why are people using cow dung and urine to treat COVID-19 in India? It is, of course, a very good question. And some people have suggested that the government actually encourages these Ayurvedic beliefs because it doesn't cost them very much, and it keeps people away from demanding a vaccine, which they don't have enough of, or therapies or hospital beds, which they don't have enough of. So there you go, a little bit of nonsense, and perhaps we've poured some sense into it. All right, now we'll bring in Jonathan with some more real scientific sense.
Yeah, thank you. This whole birds aren't real thing. I mean, I appreciate the humor of it, but as we were discussing before we started this, I don't know if we should be starting these sort of mass hoaxes based on conspiracy theories, because as we saw, like, you can't even parody this stuff anymore because some people are willing to believe anything. So there's always a little bit of danger.
This is true. I mean, this is Trumpism at large. You know, if people will believe that the election was stolen with absolutely no evidence,
they'll believe that birds aren't real.
Then maybe you can believe that the CIA has done away with all the birds, which would, of course, require quite some technology because there are a lot of birds out there.
I mean, you said the people who are waiting for which Kennedy is it to come back from the dead?
Yes, JFK's son. Yeah,
right, exactly.
Junior. Yeah.
So, at this point, anything goes.
Yeah.
But anyway, on a completely different topic, I wanted to talk about reproducibility in science. Because, okay, so we saw the nonsense. Of course, we always talk about how science is amazing and great, but there's always the principles of science and how they are applied in real life. And so let's talk about reproducibility. Because we often argue that science is indeed strong and reliable because its results can be reproduced independently. So what we mean by that? So very simply, if you have a recipe for apple pie and you say, I follow this recipe, this is the pie that I get, I eat it, it's delicious, it looks like pie, it tastes like pie, it's a very good recipe, and you give me that recipe, and I follow the recipe on my own and I get this, which is very similar, it looks like apple pie, it tastes like apple pie. I have now reproduced your recipe. Now we have this added layer of certainty that this is a good recipe, because when you use it or when I use it, we both get pretty much the same kind of result. And this is what we try, this is what we aspire to in science. Now, there are different nuances to what we mean by reproducibility, and this is from a paper that I quite like on the topic. So very, very quickly, there are sort of two main ones that I want to focus on. There is methods reproducibility, right? So if your recipe contains enough details, then I can, in theory, reproduce it, right? So if you list all the ingredients and you list the exact quantities of the ingredients, the order in which they go into the bowl, the temperature of the oven, like all of these details, then your recipe is methodologically reproducible. It is there are enough details for somebody else to come in and try and reproduce it. And then there is, what I just discussed, which is results reproducibility, what is also called replicability. So I use your recipe in my kitchen, I get a very similar apple pie, I have now reproduced or replicated your results. And both of these things are very important in scientific research. We celebrate them in theory in science, but the question always becomes, okay, so we have these beautiful principles, but do we put them into practice? And what actually happens when we attempt to put them into practice? I want to talk about two papers that came out roughly a month ago at the beginning of December. One that is basically a comment on methods reproducibility. So what happens when we look at the methodology to see if it can be replicated, if we have enough details to replicate it, and then what happens when we do attempt this replication business. And they're very, very interesting papers, and they were not shocking to me because this is unfortunately part of a larger trend that we've seen before, but it may be surprising to some of our viewers. These papers came out of, in part, the Center for Open Science in the United States, which is doing very good work. Their mission is to increase openness, integrity, and reproducibility of research. So all of these ideals that we have for scientific research, they're trying to put those into practice. And specifically, those papers came out of a project of theirs, a reproducibility project for cancer biology. Because, we know that cancer is basically the unregulated replication of cells within the body. It creates these large masses, these tumors, and then they need a lot of nutrients and oxygen, so they come up with their new blood supply. They create new blood vessels, they enter into circulation at some point, and then that can lead to distant metastases. And over the past, decades, we have had so much research being done and published on the genetics of cancer cells, on the biology of how this happens, what happens in the microenvironment of these tumors, and also how can we diagnose cancer earlier, and would this be a good treatment for this kind of cancer? There's a large body of literature on cancer biology. And what these people wanted to do is to try and reproduce some of these important results. So this was an 8-year effort. It's a massive endeavor to replicate experiments from not, nothing papers, but high impact cancer biology papers that had been published between 2010 and 2012. So they wanted to replicate 193 individual experiments from 53 published scientific papers. And as they report, there were a number of challenges in attempting to do this. So what happens first is that, in a scientific paper, there is usually a section called methodology, methods, materials and methods, where the authors, the scientists, describe what they did. And the idea is to put as many details into this, just as you would with a recipe, so that anybody can take this and be like, oh, I'm going to try and replicate this, right? So in this particular case, how many people did we recruit for this study in humans? What was the age range, the mean, the standard deviation, et cetera, et cetera. All the stuff, as many details as possible to make sure that it can be replicated. Well, it turns out that for the almost 200 experiments that they wanted to replicate, none of the protocols were completely described to the point where they could just take the paper, go to their kitchen, so to speak, and start work right away. There were details missing. So that already is a big issue, because we are supposed to be describing these experiments in as much detail as is needed for somebody else to come in and try and reproduce our work, but that was not the case for those experiments. In 70% of experiments, they had to ask the original authors for key reagents, so chemicals, for example, that had to be used in the experiment that they didn't have access to. And what's really interesting is that when you reach out to a scientist, you hope to hear back. 41% of experiments, in the case of 41% of the experiments, the original authors were actually very helpful, and they communicated with this group to give them the information that they needed to do their replication. But in about a third of cases, the original authors were not helpful, or they didn't respond to their messages. And that, again, is unfortunate, but it is part of the reality of how we do science. Some researchers are too busy to answer, or your email may end up in their spam folder, or they just don't care. They don't want you to be digging around in their stuff. Whatever the reason is, some of these scientists simply just were not responsive. So in the end, instead of being able to replicate 200 experiments, they could only do it for 50 of them, so about a quarter. And what they found were twofold, which is that the effect sizes, so if you want to think about this in terms of like a benefit, so if you have a treatment, how big of a benefit is a treatment on the disease? This effect size was actually 85% smaller on average than what had originally been reported when they replicated it. And if the original result was a positive result, which is always sexy, we like this in science, it's a positive, we found an association, we found a benefit, those original positive results were half as likely to replicate successfully than original negative results. We didn't find anything, there was no association. So 40% instead of 80%. So basically in graphic form, if the benefit was originally reported as being this big, when they replicated the study, what they found was actually much smaller, if it was there at all, because as we saw in some cases, they simply could not find this effect again. This may come as a shock. This may be surprising. This was not surprising to me because we've known about this kind of stuff for quite a few years now. Very interestingly, there was a comment that was published in the prestigious Nature scientific journal about a decade ago, in 2012 now, called Raised Standards for Preclinical Cancer Research, preclinical meaning before we involve humans, so studies done in cells or in animal models. And what was interesting about this is that this was a comment written by people who worked for Amgen, which is a big pharmaceutical company. And what happens is that these pharmaceutical companies, they will look at the scientific literature and they might see, oh, look, this paper came out of a university. They have some very interesting preliminary results in cells or in mice. This looks promising. Maybe there's a drug in there that we could eventually market and make a lot of money out of. But first, we need to make sure that their results are correct. So we need to replicate this in-house. And so these companies, they have scientists in-house that will try and replicate those findings in the literature to see if they work. Because if they do, then they can fund a clinical trial in humans and eventually, hopefully, get approval for this drug and make a lot of money. And what these people from Amgen revealed for the first time in this comment is that, well, when we try to do this for cancer research papers, we can only reproduce findings in about 11% of cases. So 1 in 10, 9 out of 10 cases, we do not find what the scientists who published these results actually found. And of course, the pharmaceutical company has a very big incentive to replicate these results because they have a lot of money to be made if these results turn out to be true. So they were quite shocked by this. But this also came on the heels of a similar comment that was made by Bayer, another big pharmaceutical company, the year before, where they reported that about a quarter of published preclinical studies could be validated to the point at which projects would be allowed to continue at the pharmaceutical company because it was promising enough. So what do we make of all of this? Is that there are ideals and there's the reality of it. I mean, there's science with a capital S. There are the ideals of scientific research, but then there is the reality of how we do science in the system that we have devised for doing research in. And it's kind of similar to how democracy works, right? So democracy is this beautiful idea of the people choosing their elected leaders. And in theory, it's a fantastic system. The reality of it is, well, it varies a lot. Right now in the United States, we're seeing it crumbling quite a bit. And that's the thing. So what do you do with this? Well, you could say, well, we should toss the whole thing out because it's not working well enough. We should toss all of science out because it's not working well enough. But of course, what do we replace science with? The problem is not science, it's not the principles of science, but it's how we apply them in the systems that we decide on as human beings. So what we need to do instead is what we were very good at in Montreal, at least it's something we know very well, which is to repair. We need to repair these systems. We need to bring out the orange cones, and we need to do repair. We need to improve the system. And scientific research has improved over the decades. But these are, of course, they're incremental improvements. And we need to keep on doing that in order to get more and more reliable research that wastes less and less time and money. So for everybody else, what to do until science with a small s reaches the ideals of science with a capital S? Well, it's to remember that single studies can be wrong. So we have to be careful in not putting all of our all of our attention on a single study. We have to look at the body of evidence that exists on a particular question, at all of the studies that have been done. And we should look for replications, even though they can be rare. But if they exist, let's look at what an independent group of scientists got when they attempted to do the same thing. And sometimes it's not about reproducing exactly what a group of scientists has done, but sometimes it's doing something that is different, but that is still asking the same question. And we saw this, for example, when cigarette smoking was linked to a high risk of developing lung cancer, is that you had these converging lines of evidence from observational studies, from experiments in animals, from a bunch of different places, all converging on this conclusion that smoking cigarettes, heighten your risk of developing lung cancer. So we have to look for those converging lines of evidence, and we have to be prepared to change our mind when better evidence comes to the fore. I mean, it's not a question of being a flip-flopper and just blindly believing one study over the other. But at some point, we have to change our mind if the body of evidence becomes much more robust because some of the initial studies turns out that they were wrong. So, so some sobering results, but hopefully this is something that is taken seriously by scientists, and we can continue to try and improve the way in which we do scientific research.
There's a related item in that when a new procedure, medical procedure, new drug is introduced, obviously research is done on a pretty small scale, because you just can't test things on more than a few thousand people. And it almost always is the case that whatever results you get in those initial studies is not reproduced when it is available to the public at large, because there are other factors involved that you can't include in your studies. And we're seeing some of that with vaccination. I mean, we discussed this when the first vaccines came out with the 95%, positive. And we said, no, this is not what we're going to see in the population at large, for several reasons. Is first of all, the people who are enlisted in such studies are generally healthy people, because you don't have people with all kinds of comorbidities volunteering for these studies. And the studies are done on a relatively short time in a relatively small number of people. So when you try to reproduce that in the population, you don't get the same results.
Yeah, I mean, what you describe is the difference between efficacy and effectiveness. I wrote an article about this for our website a little while back. But yeah, so efficacy is the benefit that you see in the context of a highly regulated clinical trial, where often, let's say that it's a drug, a nurse will administer it to the person, but maybe in the real world, you would have to administer it yourself. And then effectiveness is what happens to the benefit in the real world. And as you mentioned, there can be just so many different variables.
People misinterpret this as, that it wasn't properly done, that there wasn't enough testing, which is not the case. I mean, the world is a very complex place, and it's very difficult to predict what is going to happen. Now, another thing about the reproducibility, my mother-in-law was a super cook, and we thought it would be a good idea to ask her to write down exactly what she did in detail so that we could reproduce it. Do you know what cholent is? Have you ever heard that?
No, I don't know.
Okay, cholent is it's a traditional Jewish food. It's essentially a stew made with three kinds of beans, barley, and some beef and vegetables. And she made the most superb version of this. Of course, it had consequences after when you eat that many things, but the taste was just excellent. And we try to make sure that she wrote down every single detail.
Mm-hmm.
And it looks like she did when you look at, and I can't reproduce it. It just doesn't come out the same.
But the love, do you know when to inject the love?
Exactly. And things that experienced cooks do normally, which is just, part of their process, that they don't even think about it as being part of the process. Those things are possibly important. Yeah. So anyway, no, I've never been able to reproduce that. All right. Let me once again share this screen. We just had a paper come out this past week about how the last 7 years have been the warmest on record. So we're going to talk a little bit here about climate change. And of course, as you know, there are a lot of people who cannot separate the sense from the nonsense here and who think that climate change isn't real, that we don't have to worry about increasing levels of carbon dioxide. And these are not rare individuals. I mean, there are all kinds of publications on how global warming is a swindle, hoax, etc. But I think these days, the vast majority of the population does believe that there's something going on here, that humans are involved in climate change. And of course, when we take a look at the increase in temperatures, I mean, this is something that is well documented. This is not hearsay. I mean, since the late 1800s, we have been able to measure global temperatures very, very carefully. And not only is the average temperature increasing, but the temperature of the ocean waters is increasing. And that is very disturbing because that has a very significant effect on climate. The way that water evaporates from the ocean is what forms clouds. And the temperature of the air is what causes wind. And we have seen, of course, over the last few years, some dramatic effects of changing weather patterns. We've seen the terrible tornadoes. Just a couple of weeks ago, we saw the devastation in Kentucky. Now, of course, there are people who say, well, yeah, this is just a random event and nature, has its variations. But when you take a look at what real climate scientists are saying, and there have been thousands and thousands and thousands of papers published on this. And as Jonathan said, we don't look at any single paper. We don't even look at two papers. We look to see whether or not there is consensus. And in the research community that deals with this, there's no question. 97% of climate scientists believe that humans are involved in global warming that we are seeing. The opinions among the general public are varied, depending on where. In the US, for example, there is a significant percentage of the public that disagrees with the view that humans are involved in climate change. Perhaps somewhat surprisingly, in China, there is relatively little disagreement. But as I said, in the scientific community, there is no disagreement. And this year, the Nobel Prize in Physics was actually awarded for studying global warming and climate change. And the researchers were praised because they laid the foundation of our knowledge of the Earth's climate and indeed how humanity influences it. So there's a question of what we can do about this. Well, of course, we know the standard things. You try to decrease your reliance on transportation, take a bus instead of driving. I mean, we've heard all of these things. But I want to mention something that doesn't get talked about so much, and that is the waste in food. And this is where we really have to take a look very carefully at what we're eating, how we're producing the food, because wasted food has a tremendous impact on the environment. It is estimated that about 35% of all the food produced in the US is lost. Now, these statistics come from the US. I suspect it is very similar in Canada, but it's much easier to find American statistics. And that is valued at a lot of money, $165 billion every year. And this is a terrible waste. But more than the money wasted, there are greenhouse emissions that are associated with this. And as you can see from this analysis, it is equivalent to 42 coal-powered plants, coal-fired power plants, and all the gases that they release, the CO2. And it doesn't include the methane that is released by wasted food that ends up in landfills. And a lot of that does end up there. And when that food degrades, it releases methane, and that is a greenhouse gas. In fact, it is a more effective greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide, although the overall impact of it is less because we produce less methane than carbon dioxide. There's another aspect here, and that is the amount of food that we waste could be used to feed others. There's about 1,000 calories per person per day in North America that we waste. And that's enough to feed about 150 million people each year. So there's the environmental impact, the economic impact, and the ethical impact of all this food that we're wasting. Well, there are people in the world who are starving. Okay, but what about this contribution to the to global warming, the greenhouse effect? Take a look at where these greenhouse gases come from, and you can see it's about 6-point-something% attributed to food waste. However, that's a misleading statistic, because take a look at agriculture. I mean, agriculture, of course, is very closely linked to food production. And so there's all the energy that is invested in agriculture that we have to take a look at, and the electricity that is used in producing our food as well. So if you take a cradle to grave approach here, we start growing food. You got to plow the land, which means that you've had to make that tractor, and that tractor is using fuel. Then you have to fertilize. That fertilizer has to be made. It has to be transported to the farm. And then, of course, the tractor uses fuel in dispensing it. Once you've fertilized, you have to use pesticides. Those have to be manufactured. That has a greenhouse component. It has to be transported, and then it is used on the farm. Then at times come to harvest. That equipment has to be manufactured. And of course, there's the energy involved in the harvesting. And then you have to also transport the food on the farm. You have to transport it. And then from the farm, you have to transport it. So you have to transport the food from the farm, and of course you have to process it. And the processing of that food requires a great deal of energy. And electrical energy, that electrical energy comes from coal, from burning of natural gas, etc. And then all the washings that are involved, that also has to be taken into account. And so there's a tremendous energy expenditure there. And then we have the packaging involved, the making of the cardboard boxes, the making of the plastic packages, etc. And then you go to the grocery store, you put your groceries into paper bags, which have to be manufactured. That has a greenhouse component. You drive home, that has a greenhouse component. Then you store your food in the refrigerator, some of which eventually will get thrown out. So some of the energy that is used in the refrigeration process gets wasted. Then we cook the food, that requires energy. And unfortunately, some of the food gets thrown out. We don't eat it all. And we throw out a lot of food. We do it at home. Our kids do it in school. This is a bin in the school with those nice lunches that we fix for them that get thrown out. And then, of course, there are all the buffets, especially the all-you-can-eat buffet. Tremendous amount of food gets wasted because people's eyes are bigger than their appetite. And all of this gets thrown out. You have restaurants like Olive Garden where their main advertising is that you can eat all that you want, never-ending pasta. And again, people will serve themselves more than they actually eat. It all gets thrown out. Now, a lot of the blame can be put on the food production companies, restaurants, etc., because their main advertising relies on quantity. Get more for your money. And notice that advertisements, for example, like McDonald's, they never talk about how good their food tastes. What they talk about is the value that you get. This is American marketing. Give you more for your buck. Well, when you're getting more for your buck, you are getting more food. But that has not only an environmental consequence, it has a health consequence as well. I mean, we've seen that since the 1950s, average sizes have increased, and obviously average size of Americans and Canadians has increased as well, because the portion sizes have increased tremendously. Take a look at the difference between 1960 and 50 years later. And we see this all over. The whole idea is give people more, give them a larger serving, they'll be happy to pay more for it. And some of the sizes are absolutely outrageous. These multiple layered burgers and the gigantic size plates intended for one person. So what we need to do to cut down on waste is to cut down on serving size. Restaurants feed us much more than what we really need. Take a look at the pasta serving in a restaurant. It is far more than what is appropriate for a single meal. We don't need 440 calories of pasta at a meal. Half of that will do. Now, when it comes to the supermarkets, a lot of food gets thrown out there as well. You see people picking over the groceries. If there's a little imperfection in an apple or a nectarine, eventually that gets thrown out. Sometimes farms will overproduce food. They can't sell it all. And it gets thrown out. It gets put into landfills. And there, of course, then we have the problem of greenhouse gas emissions. All right. There are many things that can be done about this. For example, it is possible to take food waste and turn it into chicken feed. And there are a lot of chickens that are eaten. So producing chicken feed is indeed a very viable way of getting rid of some of this excess food. And there's a company that markets itself based upon this principle. It's interesting, but this will have a very small impact on overall food waste. Something else that is being done. Extra bread. A lot of bread gets thrown out in restaurants, gets thrown out in supermarket. There are companies that are turning this into beer. So they are cutting down on the amount of barley that they use, and they are supplementing it with bread. There are several companies that do this. There's Crust, Bread Ale. There's another one called Toast. I've not tasted this, but I suspect it tastes pretty good. So there are things that we can do to cut down on food waste. But I want to leave you with the last possibility, because I think this is an important one. There's a lot of food that gets thrown out because people look at the date and they see that the date is past and they throw out the food. Very important to understand what these dates mean. When you see something like the best before, it means not that at midnight of that day that food becomes inedible and you'll be poisoned by it. It means that it may have a slightly altered taste. The texture may somehow be a little bit modified. Not that it becomes dangerous. The food can be edible way beyond that date. What we need is an expiration date that tells us exactly when that food becomes unsafe to eat. And I think we need a movement here. The same way that we saw there's a movement about birds not being real, which is, of course, not a real movement. Here, we need a real movement. What we want to see on food is an expiration date. Obviously, this is not what manufacturers want. They like to put on the best before date because they know that people then will assume that the food has to be thrown out by that time. And obviously, that means that they can sell more food. So we need to move towards an expiration date on our food.
Best before dates aren't real. Spread the word.
Right. So we need to cut down on the amount of food that we eat. And not only will that have an environmental benefit, but it also has a good chance of making us live longer, because we now see in a reproducible fashion from animal studies and also now from some human studies that the lower your average caloric intake, the longer you will be likely to live. So there it is, the wasted food problem, which is indeed quite serious here in North America. So that's my diatribe for the day.
Your dietary diatribe.
Yeah. All right. So I think we've given people enough information to feed on.
Food for thought.
Food for thought. Yeah. And
something to chew on. Do you want to keep going?
All right. So we will leave it at that and be back again in a month with another dose of good science and trying to separate the sense from the nonsense. So once again, Happy New Year. And let me make a prediction here. I think that by this time next year, I think we'll be in a much better situation as far as COVID goes. So there.
I don't know. I'm thinking Omega variants. I'm not predicting the future here.
All right. Bye.
Bye, everyone.